Hello and welcome to Sergei Boutenko's webinar on practical foraging tips for wild edibles, presented by North Atlantic Books. North Atlantic is excited to introduce Sergei, a raw food authority and green smoothie expert. He's been gathering wild plants since the age of 13, and he travels around the globe conducting seminars on foraging and healthy living. Sergei is joining us today from his residence in Ashland, Oregon. His newest book, which launched in July, is entitled Wild Edibles, A Practical Guide to Foraging, with easy identification of 60 edible plants and 67 recipes. In today's webinar, he will teach you about the health and economic benefits of eating wild harvested food and how to safely identify trailside edibles. Throughout the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to send a question to Sergei using the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. For those of you using a Mac, make sure to hit the small triangle there. Questions will be read to Sergei during the last 15 minutes of the presentation during our Q&A session, and he will answer them live. Sergei, I guess without further ado, how are you today? Welcome.
I'm doing so good. Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm excited to be here and to talk to everybody and answer everybody's questions at the end.
Yeah, great. So we're going to dive right in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, so what are we starting with?
What are we starting with? Well, I guess we should talk about why people should be excited about weeds. Uh, once I was on this flight to Australia and I had 24 hours to kill. Basically, I was going to be in a plane for a very long time. And I decided that I was going to kill some of that time by making a comprehensive list of all the benefits of wild edibles. And, some of the things were pretty out there, and I didn't include them in my final list, but I did come up with 7 or 8 points that I think make wild edibles, make a good, strong cause for introducing more wild edibles into your life. And so, if you don't mind, I'll just go through that list now.
Yeah, that sounds great.
The first and foremost reason I think that we should eat wild edibles is because they're free. And essentially that's a huge benefit all around. Greens, from those of you who are aware of my mother's work, are some of the most nutritious, mineral, vitamin-rich foods on the face of the earth. And most wild edibles are essentially wild greens. The problem is when we start advocating eating 2 bunches or a pound of greens a day, per person per day, you start racking up quite a big bill. For example, in Australia, in some parts of Australia, 1 bunch of greens is about $8. So if you're eating 2 bunches of greens per day, that's about 16 bucks per person per day just in greens. And many of us don't have that sort of cash flow to be dedicating so much money to greens alone. So there you go, wild greens. They're free, they're easily accessible to the poor, to the rich, to everybody. Another reason I think that wild greens are more beneficial is because they're wild, and in my opinion, that means they're healthier. So when we buy food at the store, it's no secret that it's sometimes been genetically modified, it's been cultivated and bred to preserve longer, not necessarily to be healthier. Even organic food is grown year after year after year in the same soil that's been depleted and just thrashed. And wild food sort of goes beyond that. Wild weeds grow in soil that's more intact, may have higher mineral content, and therefore be healthier for us. I think that's really exciting personally.
Definitely.
uh, Another thing too that weeds offer us, and I'm just gonna, I know we have limited time, so I'm just gonna cruise through all of these and then, move on. But wild edibles also give us more food diversity, meaning that when you start incorporating more foods or more weeds into your diet, uh, you start eating more different types of food. And the rational benefit in that is, since all food is slightly different in its nutritional makeup, If you eat more different types of foods on a regular basis, you're guaranteed you're more likely to get to meet of your nutritional needs. And so, when you just learn about one type of wild edible, for example, like dandelion, you learn how to identify dandelions, and then you find out that there are roughly 300 species of dandelions worldwide. So in effect, just by learning one plant, you have increased your food supply by potentially 300 different plants. And I think that this is really exciting. Another benefit is that you eat locally. Previously, when I lectured as a raw foodist, as predominantly a raw foodist, I really hated this question, what about local foods? Because the majority of the food that I ate, bananas, mangoes, blueberries, often came from very far away. And I always kind of skirted around this question, but as I got more into wild edibles, I realized just how important it is to eat local food. On one hand, local food conserves resources because your average banana travels thousands of miles to get from where it's grown to your plate. Sometimes bananas actually travel more than people, I've found. Whereas if you go outside and you pick a piece of malva or purslane, the only energy you're expending is your own. And we like to call that exercise, yet another benefit. So, certainly eating locally conserves more energy. It's kinder on the earth. Eating locally is also more healthful because local plants are living in the same exact environments we're living in. And therefore, when we eat whatever it is, a piece of clover that grows in Ashland, Oregon, where I'm growing, I'm able to boost my immune system perfectly for that environment and therefore ward off, illnesses, flus, all kinds of air pollutants. So eating locally is very good for your health. A couple more for you. Wild edibles, knowing what to eat in the woods prepares you for unfortunate events. Some people are convinced that the end of the world is coming. Those people are often called preppers, people sort of storing ammunition and food in bunkers and stuff. And I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think we're all going to be fine because we have to be, right? We kind of have to get ourselves out of the mess that we create. But it's also really good to know about what you can eat if ever there are no grocery stores or food at the farmer's market. And I think it's a good idea to learn now when we have the luxury of relying on grocery stores and food versus trying to run around and learn what plants are edible or not if the next Y2K happens, for example. After those benefits, we'll talk about some of the more fresh air based ones. Basically, weeds and wild edibles they grow outside, and when you go outside, you get fresh air, exercise, vitamin D from the sun. You get relaxed. Actually, being in nature has been scientifically proven to reduce your heart rate and your cholesterol levels. And then the last kind of major benefit that I found was that when you're learning how to differentiate plants that you should eat from plants that you shouldn't, you're improving your memory. It's like working on an awesome Sudoku puzzle. So my question to everybody, including you, Nick, is now you know the benefits of wild edibles. Why is it that we don't incorporate more of them into our lives?
I don't know. Why don't we start
Sorry to
with
put you on the spot there.
yeah, no, sorry, I was fielding a few questions here on the control panel. Um, yeah, so why don't we start with where do we do this at?
So does anybody out there have any, I don't know if we can actually take people's suggestions, but I'm just curious what people think. Why is it that we don't use more wild edibles, more weeds in our daily practice? Maybe if you can't reply, you can just think about it in your head, and then I'll tell you in a few seconds. Da-na-na-na, da-na-na. I found that the biggest reason why we don't play around with weeds is because we're scared, right? We're scared we're going to eat the wrong thing and it's going to harm our bodies. And all the movies that we watch, like Into the Wild, sometimes we read in the newspaper about some other guy or other woman that went out somewhere and ate some plants she wasn't supposed to, and then unfortunately kicked the bucket. I think the main deterrent that we encounter from eating, against eating wild plants is our fear. And it starts at a very young age. When we're young, when we're like 5 years and or less, we walk around and we're learning about our environment by looking at it, by feeling it, by smelling it, and also by tasting it. So maybe you've seen in a park somewhere, you see a little kid walking around and he sees like a tree or a leaf, and those things don't have those adult labels associated with them yet. So this kid is like, oh my goodness, what is this? It's not just a tree, in quotation marks, tree. It's got bark and it's got an ant city rolling on it, and it looks so interesting. And maybe after looking at it for a while, the little kid starts touching it and smelling it, and maybe the next logical step is to take a bite and see how it tastes. But then you see mom and dad off in the sidelines that are kind of watching this, and they're nervous, so they run over to the child and they say, "Don't eat that plant. It's poisonous." Like, that's kind of a quick fix. Don't eat that plant, it's poisonous. And so from a very early age, we hear this over and over again, and we start believing it. Don't eat clovers, they're poisonous. Don't eat grass, it's poisonous. Even though our parents likely don't know if it's poisonous or not, but they say this to keep us safe. So, in a way, jumping into wild edibles, you have to kind of decondition yourself. We have to kind of unlearn what we've learned, because the truth of the matter is there are much more edible plants there than poisonous ones. And, we really don't have another alternative. I mean, I'm sad to say this, but I eat weeds because they're the cleanest, best food for me. And maybe I would eat other foods if I could, but the truth of the matter is I can't. I go to the store and, there's genetically modified food there. I go to another store and it's a large-scale organic farm that's supplying the food, and it's not the same quality as the food that I grow in my garden as weeds. So unfortunately for us, I think it's a necessity, and we got to learn how to navigate against some of the risks. And they're little risks at that, in order to be healthy and happy for the rest of our lives. You guys still there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're still here.
Cool. Is it boring? Am I killing anybody over there?
No, we have a ton of questions pouring in. So even if at some point you would want to start the question and answer round early, we can do that. But
Okay.
we'll
I'll
leave it to
still
you.
keep working on my spiel for a little bit, and then we'll do questions.
Okay, sounds good.
So on that note, if I continue my train of thought, I do think that everybody should incorporate more wild edibles and weeds into their diet. I think, like I said, that there are way more edible plants than there are poisonous plants. And I think it's safe to do as a whole family. But you shouldn't approach it carelessly and kind of, just go out into the forest and eat whatever you see. In fact, some people in the past have misinterpreted my message. They've thought that Sergei said it's okay to go in the woods and eat whatever you see. And that's not my message at all. My message, in fact, is don't eat something if you don't know what it is. And actually, I'll send you guys a link in the chat that you can watch later. It's a little rap video that I made, kind of funny, to illustrate my point a little bit. So my first rule for wild edibles is don't eat something if you don't know what it is. Basically, I treat all new plants as though they are poisonous. and only when I know that they don't negatively affect my body, when other foragers have eaten them safely, when I'm absolutely positive that I've identified something as edible, do I change that classification from poisonous to edible, if that makes sense. Because, weeds, they're not like evil doers. They're not just sitting somewhere off the side of the trail waiting to jump down your throat. If people get poisoned eating wild edibles, it's the people's fault because they knowingly ate something they weren't sure about and it harmed their body. When we start eating wild edibles, it's essentially like we go back in time. Most of us, we stopped experimenting with our food maybe after the age of 12 or 13. And when we start eating wild edibles, we sort of go back to that. And so you do have to approach it sort of cautiously at first. In fact, if I may give you guys Sergei's 3 golden rules about plant foraging. And the first one you already heard, and I recommend you guys write this down because I think it's very helpful. So Sergei's 3 wild edible rules. Rule number 1, don't eat something if you don't know what it is. We've already discussed that. I even apply this concept to regular food. If you're reading the back of some food and you have lots of long ingredient lists that you can't pronounce, maybe you shouldn't be eating that food, You don't really know what's in it. Rule number 2, try new wild edibles in small amounts the first time. Back to the allergy thing. Some people say, dandelions are 100% edible. This may be the case, but they can affect every person differently. Because you've never maybe had dandelions in your life, it's a good idea to try them in small amounts the first time so that they're not going to negatively affect you. If you make a huge green smoothie out of them the very first time, and it's going to have might potentially have a very harsh reaction with your body. On the other hand, if you just try a little piece of a leaf, even if you are allergic to that food, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. So try all new plants in small amounts the first time that you eat them. And then the third rule really is eat wild edibles one at a time. Don't mix them. Sort of in the same spirit as the allergic reaction thing, when you're going out and learning about new plants, if you take 15 different wild edibles and mix them into a salad, if for some reason you do have a reaction, it's going to be very difficult to figure out what caused that reaction. So I recommend to everybody who's starting out in the foraging realm to approach new foods with a degree of caution and then just eat kind of a mono wild edible diet. One day use chickweed in salad, the next day use dandelions in smoothies, then use something else and something else, and do that for the first couple of months until you're absolutely positive that they don't affect you negatively, and you should be all right. That minimizes your risk. There's being alive, there's risk, and that's something we just have to face in this life. And certainly wild edibles pose a little bit of risk, but not too much. Sorry, I just took a drink of water. I don't know, maybe we should just open up to questions because it's kind of nice to get feedback and know if people are listening or...
Yeah, we can definitely do that. And we do have a few people here giving us shout outs from around the country. So we had someone from Wisconsin, we had someone from Alabama. So we have a lot to choose from here. And one of them was something that you just addressed. And it's a very simple question, which is, are daisies edible? And I know you mentioned there were 300 different varieties. Is that correct?
Yeah. So daisies are edible. Oxide daisies are my favorite. In my new book, which I just got to say to you guys formally, Nick and Talia, if you guys are listening, everybody else at NAB, I love that you guys helped me put this awesome book together. I'm super proud. And this is shameless promotion of an awesome book. If you don't have my book, you may want to pick one up. But daisies are edible. They are in the sunflower family. The sunflower family is one of the biggest families of plants. And there are, most of the plants in the sunflower family are edible. So all daisies are edible. The flowers I like to use in salads to decorate cakes. The greens, to me, taste slightly like arugula. I throw them in salads, smoothies, wraps. Uh, Go for it. Try it.
That's great. And we actually have a follow-up question from a different audience member here, from Jared.
Uh-huh.
Um, Jared asks, what's the difference between dandelions and milkweed? And the follow-up question to that is milkweed edible?
I'll answer your second question first. Milkweed is edible. There's a lot of misconceptions out there that it's not. I've heard often people say, well, the white sap in milkweed is is poisonous. That's not true at all. It's a little bit hard to describe the differences of plants just in words because I mean you really kind of need a book or a video because it's kind of a fine art. You got to look at pictures and read the descriptions, and a combination really helps you to learn about uh, various plants. I can tell you this though, that the easiest way to differentiate between the two is probably to learn to identify dandelions. Way back when, one of my wild edible teachers, Karen Sherwood of Earth Walks Northwest, she sat me down once and she said, if you ever want to learn to identify a plant for the rest of your life, the thing that you have to do is establish a relationship with that plant. And the best way to do that is to just take some time and look at it, study it, and describe it to yourself. So with some plants, that's easy. You can, learn it within 10 seconds how to identify it for the rest of your life. With some plants, it might take 10 minutes. But regardless, if you just take the time and develop a friendship with it, you'll know it for the rest of your life. So if we look at a dandelion, for example, some of the things I would point out to myself if I were learning about it for the very first time, I'll just kind of go through my mental process. Basically, I know that dandelion leaves are green. Maybe this sounds silly because a lot of leaves are green, but I like to just make that, uh, just distinguish that right off the top. I also know that dandelions often have red veins. So the main vein on the leaf of a dandelion is often pinkish red, not always, but sometimes. I know that in French, de lion means tooth of a lion. And if I look at the edges of a dandelion, I know that they kind of look serrated and sharp, maybe like the tooth of a lion. I know that dandelions have yellow flowers that eventually turn into white puffballs. And I know that each flower stem produces only one flower. See, now we're getting more nitpicky. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're learning that dandelions have one flower per stem. There are other plants out there that actually have very similar looking flowers to a dandelion, but they have numerous flowers per stem. And probably the best tell of a dandelion is if you flip over the leaf and run your finger along the main vein of the stem, you'll notice that it's smooth. So this is how you identify a true dandelion 100% of the time. You pick a leaf or you crouch down to the plant, and if you run your finger on the bottom of the leaf on the main vein, it should be smooth. So at the very least, you just learn how to identify the dandelion, and then when you have milkweed in front of you and dandelion in front of you, you can sort of it's like a multiple choice question. Well, I know this isn't dandelion because I know what dandelion looks like, etc. Does that sort of make sense?
Absolutely. That was great. I just learned I'm gonna go look in the cracks in the asphalt out in our parking lot right away.
Hmm.
I guess that's maybe a follow-up question is where do you is there any place that these things don't grow? Like what is the region? Like what do you
You know, for my book, I decided not to choose to include regions because I think that regions sort of make the whole thing confusing. It can be helpful to know, like, oh, I live in the West, so I have blue elderberry here, and on the East Coast, they don't have blue elderberry. But for the most part, I found that plants travel in different ways. Birds will eat dandelion seeds, and then they'll fly across the Atlantic Ocean and spread them, and so a lot of weeds really don't have borders. And I've I've learned this over and over again on my travels. I've been to 44 countries thus far, and all of the plants in my book, I would say 80% of the plants in my book, I found in all of those countries. So we're talking, lamb's quarters, purslane, dandelions, clovers. These things grow in eastern Siberia, they grow in Australia, they grow in Europe, they grow in Mexico and Bolivia and Peru. And so I chose not to do the region thing because it's hard to say. You can't just make like a little cartoon map and say these things grow here but not there. Uh, it, what I've learned is that there are roughly few zones on the face of the earth, different climate zones. There's about 13 if I'm remembering correctly. And there's a lot of overlap between the zones, so you could be in Africa and experiencing the same sort of climate that you do here in Oregon. And because of that overlap, a lot of the plants that I encounter here are available elsewhere.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We have a follow-up question from Patrick, also
Hmm.
on dandelions, and Patrick asks, "Are dandelions edible throughout the whole life cycle?"
That's a very good question, Patrick. I'm glad you asked that. There are different beliefs about this within the foraging world. Some people say that you got to eat greens when they're young to maximize their benefit. Some people even say that uh, they have more, they're not as healthful when they're mature. I'm not really, I've used dandelions many times, both in early spring when they're just tiny little sprouts, and then later in the summer when they're more mature. I wouldn't really say that they're not good for you to eat as they mature, for any plant really. I do agree that when plants are in their early stages of development, um, they are very much more nutritious. In my book, there's a section on stems. It's a whole chapter. All foragers who want to sort of learn to forage and kind of live that lifestyle will have to at some point or another learn how to identify stems. And the definition of a meristem is essentially the growing part of a plant. So meristem equals growing part of a plant. The growing part of the plant has more carbohydrates, it has more sugars. It's the part of the plant where the cells can expand, so they're very flexible. And it's also the part that has the most amount of nutrients. A whole plant could be a meristem, and often is when it starts growing. And then as the plant begins to mature, certain parts will maintain their meristematic qualities, if you will, while other plants get more fibrous and not as pleasant. So basically, if you think about it in a logical sense, the whole plant can't grow, right? If for example, a nettles plant was all meristematic, if it was all flexible, the plant would be limited by how tall it could grow. So in the early spring, when a nettles plant sprouts out from the ground, it's a meristem, but slowly the bottom layers of the plant start to harden, become more fibrous in order to support the growth above it. And by the end of summer, you get these nettle plants that are 6, 7, sometimes 8 feet tall. You don't really want to eat the bottom of the plant. Maybe it's a little bit, it's going to be a little bit less nutritious It's going to be a lot more fibrous. It's not going to be as pleasant to eat. However, the top, the growing part, is going to be sweeter, more nutritious, more delicious. So I'm sorry if I went on a huge tangent, but basically, to answer your question concisely, you can eat plants when they're mature. I prefer to eat all plants when they're young, and if they're not young, if they're already past that kind of spring phase, then I just find the meristematic parts and eat those parts. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. All right, we have another question, and this comes from a city dweller.
Hmm.
So they say, what tips do you have on how to avoid areas that may be sprayed or affected by toxic runoff? What should we look for or be aware of?
Awesome question. I'm so glad. And right off the bat, I'm going to say you maybe should connect with Wildman Steve Brill. This is a shout out to another forager. Wildman Steve Brill lives in New York City. And it's kind of funny because in the 70s, he was leading wild edible classes in Central Park, teaching people how to be healthy and also avoid ingesting human chemicals or whatever, sprays. And they actually put him in jail a couple of times because of what he was doing. And then fast forward a few decades, like 20 years later, wild edibles, the subject was kind of becoming popular. So the city of New York actually asked Wildman Steve Brill to lead hikes for them in Central Park. It's kind of funny, I think, how that works. Basically, man-made environments are, you should be a lot more careful in them because human poisons, human sprays, human pesticides are much more detrimental, in my opinion, to our bodies than plant poisons. So what I do locally, like for example here, I before I went to forage for the first time, I called every single park service within the city of Ashland and I asked them all sorts of tough questions and they probably thought I was kooky, but I wanted to be safe. So I called the park and I said, I'm just curious, where do you guys spray? What do you spray? I know that there are like forest fires in the area. Do you guys spray fire retardant? Kind of where do your boundaries end? And when I figured out those boundaries, I started hiking and harvesting outside of those boundaries. The other thing that I was pretty shocked to find out is that our local park here downtown, they hardly spray at all. And it's just not in their budget. So that was awesome because basically I could just walk down the street and pick from Lithia Park here. The other thing I often recommend for people who live in urban areas is to cultivate your own wild edibles. And this is much more simple than going anywhere doing anything. So you can get a couple pots or a planter on your windowsill or on your balcony if you have one. And then when you're out on a hike somewhere, you collect wild edible seeds from lamb's quarters or dandelions or purslane, plantain, and you start your own little micro garden at home. If you have a little bit more property, if you're used to gardening, I would say next spring when you plant your garden, you'll notice weeds are sprouting up. Leave some of those weeds and see what they mature into. Because my bet is that those weeds that pop out are going to be very edible and potentially more nutritious than the plants that you're trying to cultivate. So what I do here personally, I have my own conventional garden for the tomatoes and the cucumbers. And then and the rest of my backyard is wild and unruly, and it's my weed garden. So I have both. It's like a green smoothie waiting to happen. I have the kind of the berries and the fruits on one side, so I can put those in my blender in the morning, and then I walk over to my weed garden and just snip nettles and lamb's quarters, and it's smoothie time.
Very cool. What about like the half-life of some of these man-made pesticides, that sort of thing?
Hmm. So if you used to spray your yard, I've heard different things. You shouldn't plant or eat anything from your yard for about 4 years. I say at minimum 2 years. kind of let the soil regenerate. But it's sort of like you can be very cautious, extremely cautious, and then you might as well not eat anything, because the truth of the matter is we live in a polluted world. Most of the food that we eat in restaurants, buy at the grocery store, comes from very toxic environments, whether it's because they're grown right on the side of the freeway and we're getting heavy metals from cars and stuff, or because we're spraying them with deadly chemicals. For a year when I was 13, I lived in Michigan, and one of the things that all the kids do in the early summer is that they go into the fields of corn and detassel corn so that it cross-pollinates and produces its fruits. What I didn't know, and I did this, what I didn't know at the time is that the farmers spray their fields so much and in special suits that they want nothing to do in their field themselves. So they hire kids who want money to kind of go into the fields and do their dirty work for them. So certainly we should be concerned about pesticides, but at a certain point, I sort of realize that I can do as best as I can, but I can't fix it all, and so I just don't worry about it at that point.
That makes sense. All right, we ready for another question?
Absolutely.
All right, how can I reconcile the conflict between wild foraging and the often repeated saying, take nothing but photographs, leave nothing but footprints, and kill nothing but time?
That is a awesome question, and I'm glad that somebody's bringing that up. It's a valid concern that I address in my classes, in my apps, in my books, in my videos. One of my worst fears is that in promoting wild edibles, I'll create an army of locusts. Maybe they'll all gather at a potluck somewhere and somebody will scream, I found purslane over here, and then everybody runs over there and they wipe out that population of purslane. What I will say, I'm going to quote Samuel Thayer in this. Samuel Thayer is another wild edible author. I really respect the guy. He's got a couple books. One is called Nature's Garden, and another one is called Forager's Harvest. He basically lays it out like it is. Anytime we build a house, anytime we pave a road, we do substantially, exponentially more damage to nature than a few hundred people eating wild plants. So that's important to remember, that, it's kind of silly to think I'm not going to go pick that dandelion or those 10 dandelions because I might harm that population, when right behind us they're building 100 tract homes. When you pave a parking lot, you kill maybe hundreds of thousands of different plant species or different plants. So that's certainly one aspect. I think that it's a lot harder to damage nature than we think. It's really resilient. When I hiked the PCT, I saw sections of highway that were abandoned for maybe 5-10 years. And within those 5-10 years, you wouldn't even recognize it. Basically, nature completely took over and it was taking the earth back. So I think that we should be mindful of the fact that we could over harvest, but I don't think it should deter us from going out and harvesting. I always advocate that we treat nature as our garden. So for example, if I'm going on a wild edible hunt with either myself or with friends, I take only what I need for 1, maybe 2 meals. I don't go out there and I think, okay, well, it's kind of a hassle to get out here, so I'm going to harvest enough for 10 meals. I just take enough for 1 or 2 meals. If I'm growing plants in my own garden, that's what I do, so I do that with nature. The other part to all of this is that a lot of the noxious weeds that many counties don't want are very edible. So if, just to play devil's advocate here, you could actually be patriotic and your local forest service could be really stoked on what you do if you eat the edible noxious plants. Recently, I was driving through Idaho, for example, and I see this little at a rest area this little pamphlet that they encourage people to take, and it was basically a guide to edible plants in Idaho, and they didn't even know it. It had about 12 plants on it, and it said, help Idaho get rid of these plants. It's your job. We need help. And on there were various varieties of thistle, uh, varieties of uh, like sunflower species, and basically over half the stuff on that list I knew to be edible. So in a way, it's actually being patriotic when you eat wild edibles. You're actually helping the local ecology. And also, in the broader sense of the word, or in the broader scheme of things, I suppose, plants, they don't know that we have toilet systems. Originally, whoever created us or whatever created us, they engineered us to eat plants, swallow the seeds, and miraculously those seeds would then come out the other end in a fresh pile of manure, thereby giving more life to the plant that you ate. And I know, I'm talking about poop here, but I just want everybody to kind of think about just how amazing that is. Like you eat this plant, which gives you life, which nourishes your body, and then in in exchange, you swallow those seeds, you eliminate them through the other end in a perfect pile of compost, thereby giving life to the plant. So is that not a symbiotic relationship? I mean, that's like the definition of symbiotic relationship right there. So originally, I think when we lived more off the land, it was even less of a concern because you always gave something back. You ate a plant, you gave back. That's my 5 cents, my 10 cents on that.
Great. Following up on that question, or speaking of, you said that you only take enough for 1 or 2 meals.
Hmm.
Kim asks, though I know it's best to eat wild edibles right away, what's the best way to temporarily store them? So,
Wild edibles are very, very perishable. So what you'll find when you start harvesting them is that they don't last very long. And that's another reason why you shouldn't harvest more than you can use because they're just going to go to waste. Uh, I don't believe in expensive refrigeration or anything like that. What I've learned over the years from friends, from my own practice, is that if you go harvesting with a bucket or a pail and you fill that bucket with a little bit of cold water, uh, anything that you harvest goes straight into the bucket stem down into the cold water, and that will preserve the plants while you're out there harvesting. And then when you come home, you can spray them down with like a spray bottle or just some cold water, put them in a bag, stick them in the fridge, and they should last 1 or 2 days. But I would be very surprised if they lasted longer than that. So cold water is probably the best thing that you can do. Shade, keep them in shade. So if you're harvesting into your bucket, don't put the bucket in direct sunlight. Try and find a bush or a tree to put it under.
do you recommend any certain type of bucket? What do you usually take with you?
I just go to the hardware store and I get the cheapest plastic bucket. It might not be the most edible food grade plastic, but then again, I'm not eating the plastic, I'm eating the edibles. And the other thing is that it's lightweight, it's not going to break, it's not going to shatter. So I just get a regular old plastic bucket.
Sounds good. All right, so we have a question from Laura, and she asks about, it's more of a comment, but I think it speaks to a
Hmm.
question, which is habits. Like, what sort of habits can people form to get into wild edibles? Some people say that it's hard to get to the point where you actually crave wild edibles. And maybe you can speak to that yourself, or the frequency with which you eat them, and how to establish those good habits.
That's another really great question. You guys, I got to just commend you that the questions coming in are top notch. Wild edibles can't compete with donuts. They can't compete with artificial sweeteners or our deep fried foods. And basically, over the years, in the same way that we've hybridized and bred certain foods, we've also sort of hybridized our tastes. Like, for example, most people don't like the taste of bitter, and yet the bitter taste is very necessary to stimulate digestion, to get your juices flowing, to aid in the cleansing of your inner organs. So dandelions, for example, are a plant that are very good for your liver, your kidneys, your pancreas. They kind of stimulate a detoxifying process in those organs. But because dandelions are bitter, many of us don't eat them just because they don't taste good, because we're so adjusted to eating other things. So the best way to train your palate to eat more wild edibles, in my opinion, is to throw them in green smoothies. Because thus far, I've learned that when you add fruits to a smoothie that has greens in it, the sweet taste of the fruits will kill the taste of the chlorophyll, the bitter taste. It will become palatable and you'll drink it. You get greens and good stuff in your diet that way. The other way that I advocate, so smoothies are the major way, and the other sort of large way that you can incorporate wild edibles into your diet is to simply just start throwing them into whatever you're making. If you're making some soup, add them into the soup. If you're making a stir fry, add them into a stir fry. And it's exciting, it's delicious, and it's fun. My friend John Callis, he's also a forager and lives in Portland. He does these retreats every year where for 3 days, all you do is you harvest wild plants and you make a meal out of them. It's actually a lot of physical labor, a lot of activity, but it's a really good immersion program if you want to learn about wild edibles. Basically, you get there on a Friday, you go out for a couple hours, you harvest some plants, and you make dinner. You go out in the morning, you harvest some plants, you make breakfast, so on and so forth. And there we really experiment with, how can I eat this? What is it good for? You just got to get creative. And it's fun. Just adding weeds into your regular recipes is a great way to start training your palate. And over time, you'll realize within the first month or two, you'll actually start naturally gravitating towards healthier foods. So maybe the first time you try a dandelion, it's too bitter for you. You don't really like it. The next time you try it, it's still too bitter. But on the third time, your body might have this natural craving for it that you'll kind of notice your mind shift, and all of a sudden you may just happen to start seeing dandelions everywhere and salivating. It's just training your body what different things taste like. And actually, in the beginning, when we started eating raw foods, we had we called them cucumber attacks. Uh, Basically, at one point in my raw food eating, I tried a cucumber, which I never used to like, and all of a sudden my body just said, yes, I want that. And so I ate 5 cucumbers within the next hour. I went to the store and I bought more cucumbers, and I ate all of those. And I just continued eating massive amounts of cucumbers for about a month until my body said, no more. You're done. I don't need whatever's in it. You can go back to eating them sparingly. So it's all about just training your body. Maybe even take yourself out in the wild and try various plants and just kind of label them to yourself. Um, Dandelion, chomp. Wait a little bit of time and say purslane, chomp. And then do it a couple of times, because it's not always enough to do it from the first time. Um, and that's all I have to say about that.
Great. We have a question from Heidi, and she asks, does arugula grow in the wild? And I think maybe that can even be broadened into a larger question about what sort of things that people buy from the grocery store that they're already familiar with. What do you think is common for them to find out in the wild that you may be able to sort of, slowly work your way into wild edibles?
Hmm. Great question. Well, arugula does grow out in the wild, but not in the arugula form. Arugula is basically in the brassica species. In that species, you also have broccoli, you have cabbage, you have kale and collards. And essentially, it's the mustard family. And there are many different mustards out there that grow wild. A lot of them are very delicious in foods. They're spicy, and they're really great in salads and wraps. And the way that you identify a mustard is, well, the easiest way to identify a mustard, in my opinion, is by the smell. If you crush up a leaf, it should have that kind of pretty harsh, spicy, mustard-like smell. Originally, our grandparents and beyond, our great-grandparents, our great-grandparents, they didn't have the access to stores that we do now. And they actually foraged a lot more for their food. I'm from Russia. I certainly remember how my grandparents used to walk around and pick various plants for our meals. I know people that were born in the US that say the same thing. And that's kind of a worldwide phenomenon that basically before stores, before people were wealthy enough to be able to go and buy groceries, they harvested a lot of their plants from nature. And so a lot of the plants today that we see in the store originated in their wild form. Like, for example, dandelions and prickly lettuce are essentially the origins of romaine lettuce and red leaf lettuce. Um, Lamb's quarters, actually, for those of you who don't know, lamb's quarters is not a meat product at all. It's just a plant that I assume lambs used to eat, and so the farmers called it lamb's quarters. It's in the quinoa family, and in fact, when you see quinoa and lamb's quarters growing side by side, you cannot differentiate the two. They look identical. So when you eat lamb's quarters, you're guaranteed to get a lot of calcium, niacin, folate, iron, as well as uh, the amino acids that are easy to assimilate. I mean, I would really sort of go as far as to say that most food that you see in the store was once and is still growing somewhere in a wild form. It's just oftentimes smaller and looks and maybe not as sweet because we certainly bred food for sweetness, for size. So the smaller, more bitter varieties of that food are still growing in the woods today.
All right. Jesse has a little story with a question. A friend just gave me seeds for wild garlic mustard. I'm concerned
Hmm.
about it being invasive, though. How do you feel about growing wild invasive plants? And she's saying, I also want to grow Jerusalem artichoke.
Well, you don't want it to take over, that's for sure. And one of the best ways that I know how to do that is to go to a place where they can cut like a wooden wine barrel in half and just grow your invasive species in a way that you contain them. So certainly, in my garden, mint is pretty invasive and stuff. So I just figure out what spreads and takes over, and I grow those plants separately in planters.
That's very good advice.
But also, a plant is only as invasive. Um, I have no trouble. I have less trouble actually with invasive plants now that I have a Vitamix and that I blend smoothies because they just can't keep up with my smoothie intake.
Mowing it down, huh?
Yeah, totally. You could get a goat too. Goats will help.
Would I don't know. That might require some city ordinance licensing. I don't know. Is that
Unless
a
you live in
section in
San
the book?
Francisco, then
Maybe
you
in the
can have
updated edition.
goats in city limits.
Right. All right. Let's move on to another question from Kim, and it's taking it back to the question of allergies again. She says, I love certain kinds of foods like cucumbers, watermelon, and tomatoes, but I get a reaction from it. Um,
Hmm.
can wild edibles help you reduce your sensitivities to certain foods?
I'm gonna have to say yes, and it's not really wild foods in general. I'm just saying I think eating healthier eventually resolves many allergies. My mom used to be pretty deathly allergic to peaches and peach skins in particular, and she loved peaches, just couldn't ever eat them. And as we started eating healthier, she once, like a few years down the road, somebody gave her a pie, like made a raw food pie with peaches in it. She ate it. She was a little bit scared when she found out there were peaches in it, and then nothing happened. Seasonal allergies, I used to suffer from seasonal allergies as well. It became a non-issue after my body detoxified. So I would say that it's very possible with diet to reduce or eliminate your allergies completely, but you don't really want to test the boundaries too much. You want to have kind of let your body do its thing and be gentle with it. So what I would say, what if I were you, what I would do personally is just every few months, every 3 months, just kind of return to that food and eat a little bit and see how it reacted to you. If you still got a reaction from it, maybe keep doing the smoothies, keep eating other things. Don't force yourself to eat that thing. And then 3 months later, kind of try it again because our bodies are constantly changing, and it's just good to kind of know where they stand.
Right. So like your earlier advice, baby steps, try little
Exactly.
quantities at a time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are running down on our time here. I think we have time for one last question, and it comes from Antoine, and I think it'll be a great one to wrap up with. And that is a question of seasonality. Do you manage to find foraging greens all year round throughout all seasons?
In Oregon, I do not. Basically, our foraging season here in Oregon is mid to late April until about early October. If I were very, if I wanted to live off the land for the entire year, I would probably, if I lived close to nature, I'd probably pack up my stuff at the beginning of October and start hiking south. Um, so yeah, it's pretty limited up here in the tropics. You're gonna have more variety. Uh, I often harvest plants throughout summer, kind of freeze and dry them so that I have something wild to eat in the summer months, in the winter months. And then there are a few plants like rose hips, for example, that are out November through February that are a nice boost of vitamin C and other vitamins in the winter months. But generally, you got to get kind of proactive about it if you want to eat wild edibles in the winter months.
Okay. Well, we are coming up on the hour here. For those of you who have additional questions in the audience, we do host a forum on nabcommunities.com, and I know that Sergey will be able to jump on there and field a few more questions as a follow-up to the webinar. And also keep an eye on your email because in the next few
Hmm.
days we'll be sending all of you details about a special ebook discount on Sergey's wild edibles. Um,
Yeah,
Sergey, we can't thank you enough for joining us today. There's a lot of really great information here for people to digest, and they should go get the book.
yeah, you guys should go get the book. I'm very proud of it, and that says a lot because I'm a perfectionist. Thanks you guys for having me. I've enjoyed talking with you, Nick. Thanks for hosting, and I'll see you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending today. On your screen, you can see the URL for the forums as well as Sergey's website. Thank you everyone, and this is the close of the webinar.